In 1985, in my second year in college, I interned at the Studio Museum in Harlem. And I had been an art history student at Smith for, at that point, a year and a half, and had not, at that point, taking American art and contemporary art classes, not been taught any African-American artists. And that in the internship at the Studio Museum, then led by Dr. Mary Schmidt-Campbell, that team gave me a real education. And because I already was on the path to be a curator, that education often came through the history of exhibitions. So I knew, for example, that the first exhibition of an African-American artist at the Museum of Modern Art was the William Edmondson exhibition in 1937. But more significantly to the trajectory I was on was the 1971 exhibition of Richard Hunt's work and the 1971 exhibition of Romeo Bearden's work that happened. And in many ways, those two exhibitions and a few more, jumping to 76, David Driscoll's 2 Centuries, are what formed the spine, right, for me, of the world in which I would inhabit as a curator. When I became a curator in 1991 at the Whitney, I was the first Black curator in the Whitney's history, something that many African-American artists had been advocating for since the late 60s, quite literally protesting in front of the Whitney to make happen. And Richard was one of the many artists who made me know what I had to do, right? What the mission was, and who it was on behalf of. And it wasn't any of them individually. It was for all the artists that came before them and for them, because by this time, remember, this is 1991, almost all of that generation had major exhibitions in the 70s, and then many institutional lapses that then meant that there was not the same engagement. Now, what I will say is also I knew Richard because he was one of the many artists that held the Studio Museum in its idea and its actualization in very real ways. And so the institution that devoted itself, right, to thinking about what it meant to steward the works and the legacies of Black artists was also important. But in those first years, it was to really say to me, you know, you have a job to do on behalf of us all. And no one gave me that message with more love than Richard, right? Always. And it was one of many experiences, and what I hold and love the most about Richard was just the joy for life. Now, you see it in the work, right? Because the works kind of live, right, in this spirit of joy and rhythm, while they are also resisting in deep ways. But he always existed, right? With the sense of potential, with the sense of possibility, and with a sense of joy. And that evening, I saw that. But what I also saw was the commitment until the end to continue working. And so it's with a great amount of commitment of myself to understand that that joy was the sort of engine that moved him, someone born when he was, to create and think about the possibility of what it meant to be an artist, but to do it on behalf of himself, but also specifically on behalf of what it meant to be an innovator and open up so much artistic space and intellectual space, and to hold the culture so deeply in his heart. The whole range of public works, right, that Richard made across this country. Within that, there's not only a way to look at the, you know, the aesthetic transformation of the work and look at the different ways in which he made work, but also, and something that, you know, I had the occasion to have the conversations about, that so many of those sculptures, public works, involve processes that also speak to his politic, right, of wanting work, not just in public places. These were not private developer, you know, commissions. Often public processes that required him to engage in community-based processes, and the commitment to that, right? Not as a career move, I'll do 1 or 2 public sculptures to put on my resume, but as a literal part of the practice. Big projects, small projects. And, you know, I think about it and I think there must have been at least 1 or 2 public projects happening all the time.
I met Richard around 3 years ago. Pamela Joyner, thank you, and Gregory Miller contacted me and introduced me to the Arts, and they were saying they were making Richard's first monograph of his then 60-some-odd-year career, and you know, they wanted me to contribute an essay to this man's amazing history. And it was during the pandemic. And so we got on Zoom, and then I met Richard, I met John, I met the Otts, an amazing family who love Richard still. And, you know, Richard was so patient and just so in tune. But my main thing with Richard is grace. You see his sculptures, they are, you know, gigantic, they're momentous, they're epic in terms of theme, in terms of how they're made, and, you know, they go from spot welding to cutting and then aluminum. It's a genius, but you would expect someone to have an ego. Well, for one, Richard was a prodigy. He was making work during a moment in American history when, what did it mean to be a young black man in a 4-block proximity to Emmett Till? What did it mean to be a young black man to go to Inglewood High School where Sam Cooke went to high school, when in Chicago you had the rise of R&B coming from church music? And so Chicago was a kind of a foundry of creation during this time of segregation in America. He and his family went to the funeral of Emmett Till. And so what did it mean then to take that cultural history and then see sculpture in the 20th century at the Art Institute of Chicago and say, you know what, Picasso, I got you. What did it mean to have your first work acquired by MoMA as an undergraduate? I grew up in Queens, New York, and I would go to Parsons and Archer. There was so much art there. There was a Sam Gilliam in the subway, right? I would skip school sometimes. Education is relative. And I would go, and I would sneak out. Actually, this was on the York College campus. And there's a Richard Hunt there. I was 14 years old, the first time really on the college campus, and I would sit down and I would draw that Richard Hunt. But it was accessible, is what I'm saying. Having art that's accessible to the public, you really can't overdetermine or think you know how people will respond to something and where that response will lead them, because they may want to see more. For me, it brought me into a life in art in which I found community.
The first time I met Richard, he came to my show at Kavi Gupta in 2019, and he came in and he was smelling like the studio, which is like working with metal. It's a very particular smell. It kind of smells like blood or copper or pennies. And so we were kind of in our own little cipher, and I was talking to him. The essence of that dialogue was very much him kind of pointing at his eye and pointing at the work and then being like, you know, I see you, I understand what you're doing, keep going, you got it. Working with steel, working with metal, it's a really interesting experience because you have this organic material that you then implement electromagnetic currents into it. And you watch something that is so incredibly strong and durable melt into liquid. And, you know, for thinking about Richard's work, thinking about Giacometti and Barbara Chaser Bow and Calder, you know, there's a certain, it's really the levity for me. It's the alchemy, and it's the ability to lift a material like that and to create that kind of particular gesture. And, you know, I think about the abstract expressionists and I think about the surrealists and like the melding of those two genres into sculpture and into steelworking is such a special thing that he's created.